Saanich Sooke.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'd like to beg the indulgence of the House for just one moment as I begin to mention the tragic loss of life in my riding Friday night in the community of Sooke, where flooding appears to have taken the lives of Corey Mills, Eric Blackmore, and A.J. Jensen. We will learn more about the actual details of this incident as time goes on, and I believe that we also need to look into the larger context where climate change, more severe storms, clear-cut logging, and all of these have contributed to more severe flooding in my riding, and see if there was a connection to that loss of life. Sooke is a community where many volunteers came out to search when these young men went missing on Friday night, a tribute to the strength of volunteerism in the community of Sooke, and I thank all those volunteers who helped in the search. Now, turning to the question before us this morning, I want to again begin by expressing my condolences to the family and friends of Marilyn Levesque for this loss, which is a loss not only to them, but a loss to all Canadians. The NDP will be supporting this motion put forward by the Conservatives today because obviously we need an investigation as to how something like this could happen in Canada. This tragic incident raises questions about the specific decisions of the parole board and parole officers in this case. And these are important questions because by and large we have a parole system which serves the public well and helps to guarantee public safety in this country. So when something clearly goes so off the rails to result in a tragic incident like this, we have to have answers about what happened in our system. How could this have been allowed to happen when the perpetrator had a previous conviction for the murder of his wife and was under supervision? How in the world do we get to a situation where another young woman loses her life at the hands of this same person who Canadians had taken a responsibility through our parole system to guarantee the public that they would be safe from his further violence and further actions? So that is indeed an important question. But this motion perhaps doesn't go far enough in that it doesn't really tackle those larger questions about the role of gender-based violence in Canadian society, about how we value women's lives and how we sometimes don't value women's lives to the extent that we should. And in particular, when it comes to incidents of intimate partner violence, where somehow this is seen as a lesser form of violence, and that the perpetrator of violence on their partner is somehow seen as less of a threat to Canadian society as a whole than other violent criminals. This simply makes no sense to me, but is clearly a factor involved in this case. We also have to ask ourselves how much we value all women's lives, including the wives of sex workers. So the Parole Board, I think, clearly played a role, and its parole officers clearly played a role in perpetuating these problematic attitudes about women and violence toward women in our society. And so, yes, I support this motion because we need to look closely at who's being appointed to those parole boards. Do we have a sufficient number of women on the parole boards to help evaluate risk and set policies to evaluate risk? Are those people being appointed to the parole board for the right reasons? And I know the Conservatives have raised this question. Parole board appointments should not be a question of patronage. They should be a question of appointing people who represent the community's values, and can help set those very important policies that prevent innocent lives being lost. We also need to look at the question of the training that we provide to parole board members. So are we making sure that they're adequately trained in gender-based violence? Are we making sure that they're adequately trained in the rights and responsibilities they have as parole board members, not to perpetuate these attitudes which sometimes value certain women's lives less than other lives in our society? So let me talk a little bit more again about the specifics of this incident. There's the question we need to ask about how risk was evaluated. And I want to take a moment here to quote from a UBC law professor, Isabel Grant, who I think raises some very important questions. And what she said was, I think that this case really shows the degree to which we do privilege male entitlement to women's bodies over the safety of women. I think it reflects, too, this idea that men who killed their girlfriends or wives or intimate partners don't present as much of a threat to the public as other men. And Professor Grant went on to say, I think that's problematic and shows how we see the safety of women, particularly the most marginalized women, and how little priority we give it, how little priority we give their safety. So we need to have this inquiry that asks those questions about risk evaluation, and in particular, how we evaluate the risk of men who perpetrated violence on women in the past. Secondly, there's this whole concept that seems to have invaded this case, whereas the perpetrator had sexual needs that needed to be satisfied. I can't imagine what this discussion is doing in a question of parole and risk. There is no right of men to have their sexual needs satisfied by women. There's no such thing that exists. And I can't imagine how this became a subject of discussion for a perpetrator where the parole board had already said this person is not ready for evaluation or ready for relationships with women, yet was suggesting that this person should visit sex workers for sex as if this is not some kind of a relationship with a woman for which he would obviously and clearly also not be ready. So really, we do have to look at the specific case and ask those tough questions of what attitudes lie behind these kinds of decisions. Then we have the very problematic question to ask parole officers and parole boards. Since under our current law, seeking sexual services from a sex worker and paying for those services is illegal, are we really talking about a parole system that suggested a perpetrator on parole should commit an illegal act, which by its nature, commission of that illegal act, should have canceled his parole and returned him to custody? Are we really talking about this situation where somebody was from within the system advising a perpetrator to commit an illegal act? I would like to have an answer to that. I think all Canadians would like to have an answer to that very specific question. That's why the NDP is supporting this Conservative motion, because on those narrow questions we have some very, very important answers to get. And when we get those answers, I think we have to look very seriously at changes in policies that allowed these kinds of things to happen. Now, when we come to the broader question, again, the broader context, we have to ask ourselves about a correction system which had a perpetrator in custody for 15 years and failed to rehabilitate him. Now, we all know there are challenges in our correction system with lack of resources. We all know there are challenges raised by the very large number of people in our correction system who have mental illness or mental health problems and addiction problems. So these are real challenges that our system has to face. But I would submit that there are a few cases, there are some cases where rehabilitation will fail. And when that rehabilitation fails, then we have a responsibility in our correction system to keep the person in custody or to carefully supervise their release. And so that broader question is raised again about how successful are we being at rehabilitation, and especially in the cases of violence against women, how seriously are we taking the failure to rehabilitate men? Now, in the broader context of the safety of sex workers, there's a very interesting, I guess I'll call it a twist. I don't really like the tone of that word, but a twist in this case, because clearly the perpetrator had visited this massage parlor before. We know this from many reports, and had been banned because of his violence toward the women who worked in the massage parlor. Normally, if this was a normal place of work at which violence occurred, it would have been reported to the police and it would have resulted in the revocation of his parole. But because a massage parlor under the current legislation is illegal, that it's illegal under current legislation in Canada to provide a safe place for sex work to take place, we have the cruel irony that the massage parlor could not report this person to the police without risking shutting down the safe place that had been established for sex work to take place. So I think we're into the broader question of our laws on sex work in Canada. And many in the House will know I've spoken on this many times. I've worked with sex workers in my riding on a harm reduction strategy, not a judgment strategy, and a rights-based strategy, not a rescue-based strategy. And it's very, very important, I think, that we look at this case as an example of what's wrong with our current restrictive laws on sex work. Many people say to me, well, we only criminalize the Johns. That's not actually true. That's not what happened in the legislation. We criminalize all kinds of things around sex work that make sex work more dangerous. So we criminalize providing a safe space for it to take place, commonly called brothels or massage parlors, but what those really are is a safe place for women to perform sex work. We criminalize hiring security to provide safety, because that would be under the provision that someone is somehow profiting from sex work by being hired to provide that security. So we criminalize that. I could go on with a list of things that we criminalize all the way around sex work, and each and every one of those provisions makes sex work more dangerous for the women involved. I happen to have the privilege of having the Peers Sex Worker Drop-In Center in my riding. Also, when I was on council, it was in my municipality. And I learned from meeting with sex workers in my riding and from the staff at the Peers Society what sex workers organizations can do when they're empowered to provide safety to their members. And so rather than criminalizing sex work, I would like to see us taking a harm reduction strategy which empowers sex worker organizations. Now, what do I mean by that? It's more than just a nice phrase. It means who provides bad date lists, as they're called? Who keeps track of the men who are violent toward sex workers? It's sex worker organizations who have that information. And one of the functions they perform in every local venue, I'll call them venues, is to make women who are involved in sex work aware of those men who are violent and dangerous. So I think we need to be supporting sex workers in providing that service. Unfortunately, of course, we can't involve the police in that at this time because of the criminalization of all these pieces around sex work. The Peers Drop-In Society in my riding provides many, many social services for women in the sex trade who are faced with housing crises, who are faced with childcare crises, who are faced with all the same challenges that other workers face in our society. And once again, the key to all those services is not judgment about why women are in sex work, not judgment about whether sex work is a good or a bad thing, but how we can make lives better and lives safer for those who are already involved in sex work. We have a charity that's based in Victoria called Hero Work. And Hero Work provides volunteers to help renovate the premises of community social service organizations. And most members of Parliament will be quite aware that one of the problems that our charities have is much of their infrastructure is quite old, quite decrepit. Their workplaces are not actually very good places to work. Many of them mold infested and other real health challenges. So Hero Work selected as one of its projects the renovation of the Peers Drop-In Center. And they mobilized literally hundreds of volunteers around the community to come in and make over the drop-in center and make it a more welcoming and supportive place, including creating a community kitchen so they can provide meals, showers, and other services to those who are involved in sex work in my community. And the interesting thing we found was the project of renovating the drop-in center brought volunteers from all through the community who might never have not gotten to know sex workers and played a large role in changing their attitudes toward what happens in sex work in my community. So in this debate, I think it's important that we extend our thinking to whether we have taken the right approach to harm reduction in sex work and how that connects directly to the incident that we have in front of us that caused the loss of life. Many hundreds, literally hundreds of sex workers have lost their lives in this country, and it beggars belief that those involved in our parole and correction system could think that they would send a person who has a record of violence with women to the most vulnerable women in our society and not expect a bad and tragic outcome like the one which occurred in Quebec City. So, Madam Speaker, I just want to sum up again by saying, yes, we need to look at the specific decisions that were taken by Parole Board in its review of the actions of the parole officer and by the parole officer. Again, I want to say, I, who taught criminal justice for 20 years and have a prison, federal prison in my riding, I know that most of the time, this system does very good work on behalf of all Canadians. So let's look at the specific decision and figure out what went wrong in this decision. And secondly, I'm supporting the motion, but I would like to see us expand the terms of reference so we think about those larger issues in our society of gender-based violence, of intimate partner violence, and of the safety of sex workers. When we have taken a look at those issues, then I think we'll have a responsibility to act as legislators in this House to make this a better and safer Canada for all women, including sex workers. Thank you, Madam Speaker.